Stubborn cowboys die alone. Not you, said the widow, after he rode back through the storm. The horse came back without me. That's how she knew something was wrong. I didn't know that part until later, that she'd looked out past the fence line and seen Cutter come in alone, reins dragging, lathered in spite of the cold. She told me she stood on the porch in her coat and watched him a long time, thinking maybe I'd just come loose in the saddle somewhere near the creek and was walking. She gave it 20 minutes. Then she stopped giving it time. I'll tell you what I remember of that night. I remember the first strike of sleet against the back of my neck, under the collar. I remember thinking it wouldn't amount to anything sleet that early in the evening. It never did in that country. It'd blow itself out before dark. I was wrong about that. By the time I got out to the south pasture to check the fence line, the Buell brothers had cut through again. The light was gone, and the ground was ice, and the wind had swung around out of the northwest and hit me like a door being slammed hard in my face. I'd been riding that land 12 years, and I still underestimated the speed a storm could change character in November. You'd think a man would stop being surprised by the things that have already surprised him, but that's not how it seems to work. I turned Cutter back toward the house. He wanted to go. He was a good horse, sensible about weather the way some horses are, and he'd already started turning his head into the wind before I asked him. We crossed back through the north draw and came along the creek, and that's where things went wrong. The water was low. Creek runs shallow in November, after the dry weeks, and it had been a dry autumn. But low water in that cold moved fast over the rocks, and the bank on both sides had frozen over a thin shelf of ice over mud, and you couldn't tell from looking how far the shelf went. I thought I knew the crossing. I'd used it 100 times. I took Cutter at an angle, the way you're supposed to, and he got across the water fine and tried to climb the far bank, and the ice gave way under his left front, and he went down sideways, and I went with him. He got up. He's a good horse. He scrambled and found his feet, and stood blowing hard on the bank above me. I didn't get up all the way. My left leg had caught something under the water when we went down a rock or a root or a chunk of submerged log. I never did find out, and it had hit hard enough that when I tried to stand on it, the leg folded. Not a clean break. I didn't feel a snap, but something was very wrong in the lower part of the bone, and I couldn't put weight on it. I got myself out of the water on my hands, and the one good knee. Cutter stood above me and blew and shifted his feet. I grabbed at his stirrup, but the angle was wrong, and he sidled away from me, spooked by my pulling, and when I let go of the stirrup, he stood just far enough above me that I couldn't reach. "Easy," I said to him. My teeth were already chattering. "Easy now." He looked at me. I looked at him. He took 2 steps up the bank away from me, and then stopped, and looked back, which was his way of telling me he wasn't leaving, but he wasn't coming closer either, and there wasn't much I could say to argue with him about it. I crawled up the bank as far as I could manage, and I rolled onto my side, and I put my back against the clay. The sleet had turned to something between sleet and snow, coming at an angle, and the wind was working hard. I pulled my coat tighter. My gloves were wet through. I lay there, and I looked up at the dark, and I thought about what I was going to do. And what I was going to do was get up and walk. I got up twice. Both times the leg buckled before I could put any real weight on it, and I went down. The second time I went down, I hit the bank hard with my good knee, and lay there a while. I dropped my hat somewhere in the creek, and I couldn't see it, and I wasn't going back for it. I am going to tell you something now that I don't particularly enjoy telling. When I lay there the second time and looked up at the dark and the snow coming down, I did the arithmetic of my situation. Not the practical arithmetic, not how far I was from the house, how far I was from Dora's place, what the temperature was going to do, what the chances were that someone would come looking. The other arithmetic. The kind you do when you're cold enough and alone enough and have been alone long enough that you start adding up what you're worth to the world and what the world would lose if you weren't in it anymore. What I came up with wasn't much. I had 60 head of cattle that would need feeding. I had a mortgage with the bank in Rutherford that had another 4 years on it, and which I had been current on, though barely. I had a horse who was already making his way home. I had a neighbor, Dora Prentice, who would probably end up with the trouble of dealing with my affairs. I had a brother in Missouri I hadn't spoken to in 6 years. I had a grave in the small cemetery near Millhaven where my wife Mary was buried, and I'd kept up the plot, but I hadn't been able to stand at it without something dark coming over me, so I hadn't been out there in 3 years. That was the whole ledger. That was everything. I want to try to explain to you how a man gets to a place like that. Because I think it matters, and because I don't want you to think it happened fast. It didn't happen fast. It happened the way the creek bank erodes every season. A little more of the edge goes. And you don't see it day to day. And then one high water. It's gone. And you're standing further back than you thought. I came to this country when I was 28. Mary and I had been married 4 years. We came out from Ohio with a stake my father had left me. And the idea that the land was cheaper here, and the work would be the same, and we'd build something from it. That was the idea. And for a while, it was working. We built the house not all at once. First the single room with the fireplace, then the back room, then the lean-to, and the small barn, and we built the herd from 7 head to 40, and then to 60, and Mary had a garden that she was ferocious about, and in the evenings, she'd read to me from whatever she could get her hands on, and I'd work the leather or oil a saddle, and we'd talk about things, and then not talk about things, and that was enough. She got sick on a Tuesday. By Sunday, she was gone. That's a thing that I have never been able to make sense in my head, and I stopped trying to make it make sense years ago. The doctor came from Rutherford, and he did what he could, and it wasn't enough. And then he told me there was nothing else, and he went back to Rutherford. And after that it was me, and the cattle, and the land. The work kept coming, like I said. The cattle still needed feeding. The fences still needed mending. The mortgage still needed paying. I kept doing those things because there was no one else to do them, and because the alternative was not doing them, which had consequences I couldn't afford. So I kept doing them. And I kept doing them the next year, and the next, and the cattle numbers held and the mortgage got paid down, and I suppose from the outside it looked like a man who was getting on all right. But getting on is different from living. I want to be honest about that. I was getting on. I had stopped not all at once, but steadily. The way the bank erodes, I had stopped imagining that any of it added up to anything beyond the next season. When you stop imagining forward, you can still work. The hands still know what to do. But something goes out of it. I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm just telling you how it was. And I want to be clear about this. I wasn't lying there deciding to die. I wasn't doing that. I was just noticing, very clearly, how little there was to pull me back up. There's a difference between deciding to let go and noticing that your grip on things was never as tight as you thought. I was doing the second one. And I was cold and my leg was starting to hurt less, which I knew was a bad sign. And I closed my eyes for a bit because I was very tired, and the snow coming down on my face was like a weight. And I thought I'd just close my eyes for a minute. I should tell you who she was, since she's the whole reason I'm telling any of this. Her name was Dora Prentice. She'd been Dora Calloway before she married Tom Prentice, who died of a kick to the chest from his own mule, 3 winters before any of this. She ran 60 head of cattle on the adjoining property, and she did it mostly alone, with Clem, a 14-year-old boy. Good instincts, still learning to use them. Dora was 43 or 44. She had gray coming into her brown hair, and wore it in a braid, and didn't spend any time on it. Her hands were rough like mine. I'd come over twice to help when she was putting up her winter hay, and she'd come over twice to help me mend fencing after a windstorm took down a 1/4 mile of it. We'd eaten together maybe 6 or 7 times over 2 years. She made good coffee. She didn't fill silence with chatter just to fill it. There are people out here who can't tolerate quiet. They'll talk about the weather and their horses and the cost of flour just to push the quiet back. And I'd never had patience for that. And she was not that kind of person. The town thought well of her. She paid her accounts. She didn't ask for help she couldn't carry. When Mrs. Garvey lost her husband and was left with 2 small children and no money for winter provisions, Dora had turned up at her door with a quarter beef and a sack of flour. I only knew because Clem mentioned it once. She never had. Some people in the county thought she was cold. I didn't think she was cold. She just didn't perform warmth she didn't feel, which meant that when she was warm, you could trust it. I wouldn't have called us close. But I had paid attention to her, in the way you pay attention to someone you respect. I heard her before I saw the lamp. I heard her voice, actually not talking to me, talking to the dog. Soot was his name, a big red cattle dog she'd had for 5 or 6 years, smart as anything, And she'd sent him ahead, and he'd found me by smell in the dark, while she was still 30 feet back with the lamp. He came up, and put his nose against my face, and it was warm and wet, and I must have made some kind of sound, because I heard her say, in a steady voice, "He's there. I hear him." The lamp swung toward me. She came down the bank, holding it out front of her, and she had her rifle on her back, and her coat buttoned to the throat, and her boots had been resoled recently. I could see the lighter leather of the new soles against the dark. Bank. She crouched down in front of me. She didn't say my name. She didn't say, "Are you all right?" or, "Oh my goodness," or anything like that. She just held the lamp up and looked at me for a moment, taking account of what she was looking at. "Your horse came in alone," she said. "Yeah," I said. She held the lamp over my leg. The left leg of my pants was dark with water, and it had begun to stiffen. She looked at it without touching it first, just looking. "Can you stand?" she said. I tried a couple times. "The leg doesn't hold. Can you stand with help?" I thought about it. "Maybe. Maybe's not a no," she said. And she set the lamp on a flat rock and got her arm around my back. Getting me up off that bank took the better part of 10 minutes. She was a strong woman, not large, but she'd been doing heavy work alone for 3 years, and there was real strength in her, and she got under my right arm and let me take as much weight on her as I needed. When I was upright and had my right foot under me, she held on while I tested the left, and when the left buckled, she took the weight again, without staggering, just reset her feet, and held. "We'll do without the left," she said. "Lean on me." "That's too much to ask." "You didn't ask. I'm telling you. Lean on me." I leaned on her. She'd crossed at the upper ford, a ford I'd always considered inferior to the lower one, which tells you something about my judgment that night. The upper ford added maybe a quarter mile to the walk back to her house, but it was a flat rock bottom, and you couldn't fall wrong on it. She knew the land. She'd been reading it for years, the same way I had, and she knew where the ground was solid and where it wasn't, and she steered us without talking about it. The lamp in her free hand, and soot ranging ahead through the snow. I couldn't tell you exactly how long it took. It felt long. The snow was coming heavier, and the wind had dropped a little, which should have felt better, but actually just meant the cold settled more completely. No gaps in it. At one point I went down, not the leg, just lost purchase on an icy patch, and I took her partway down with me, and she made a short, sharp sound, pain or surprise or both, and when I apologized, she said, "Don't be sorry, just keep going," and she got me back up. Her kitchen was warm. She'd left the stove loaded before she came out, and it had been going a while, and the heat hit me in the face like a wall when she got the door open. She put me in the chair beside the stove, and she got my coat off and then my boots, and the left boot was the trouble. The leg had swelled inside it, and she couldn't pull it off without hurting me. And she looked at my face once when she tried, and then she reached over and took a pair of scissors off the shelf, above the stove, and cut the boot down the back seam, and worked it off that way. She didn't even wince at ruining the boot. She just cut it and kept going. "Good boots," I said. "Still got the other one," she said. Her husband's old medical book was on a shelf above the stove. It was a thick book, cloth-covered, spine repaired with black electrical tape at some point. She took it down and found a page, and read for a moment, and then she put the book down on the table open, and she knelt down and pressed along my shin with her thumbs, starting at the ankle and working up, watching my face the whole time. It hurt. A particular kind of hurt, a deep bone pain that makes you want to pull away from the pressure. I didn't pull away. "Not broken," she said. "Cracked, maybe, or bruised deep. The bone would move if it was fully broken, and it's not moving." She stood up. "Still going to hurt like one for a while. It already does." "Well," she wiped her hands on her pants. "You're not riding anywhere on it tonight." She bound the leg, and she made me drink 2 cups of hot coffee, and she gave me a pair of her husband's wool socks, dry, and she got the feeling back into my hands with hot water and a cloth. She did all of this without ceremony, without fuss, the way you do a thing that needs doing. When she was done, she looked at me in the lamplight and she said, "You need to eat." "I'm all right. You've been in cold water and cold air and you're shaking. Eat." I ate. She made cornmeal porridge with a pour of molasses, and I ate all of it, and she ate beside me, and we didn't talk much while we ate. Just the storm outside and the fire in the stove, and the dog settling under the table at her feet with a long sigh. She had one bedroom, her bedroom, and she put me in it. I told her I could sleep in the chair by the stove. She said the chair wasn't long enough, and my leg needed to be flat, and that was the end of that discussion. I woke up twice in the night. Both times the lamp was burning low in the other room, and I could see a sliver of the kitchen through the gap in the door. And she was in the chair with her coat over her like a blanket, and her feet up on the footstool her husband had made. You could tell he'd made it himself. It was a bit rough, the legs not quite even. She wasn't sleeping, or if she was, it was a very light sleep, just sitting there. The second time I woke, I said, through the gap, "You don't have to sit up all night." "I know," she said. "I mean it. Go to sleep." There was a pause. Then she said, "I'll sleep when I'm tired." Her voice was quiet and even. "Go back to sleep yourself." In the morning, the storm had moved through, and the sky was the hard blue you only get after a big snow, and the sun off the white ground was severe enough that I had to squint hard to look out the window. She was already up and had coffee made and was outside. When I woke, I could hear her breaking ice off the water trough, the steady crack and splash of it. She came back in red-cheeked from the cold and found me standing in the kitchen on my one good leg, holding the counter. "Sit down," she said. "I can stand." I didn't say you couldn't. I said sit down. I sat down. Clem brought Cutter over that afternoon. He was a 14-year-old boy, Clem, with big hands he hadn't grown into yet and a serious face, and he led Cutter up to the porch and tied him off and came inside and ate 3 biscuits, and then went back out to help Dora with the afternoon chores without being asked. He was a good kid. She'd been teaching him the cattle work, and he was learning it, doing it out of loyalty to her more than anything, because his own family's place was 10 miles east, and he'd chosen to be here. I stayed 3 days. I could have left after 2, the leg was sore, but manageable. And by the second morning, I could get my weight on it for short periods if I was careful. But she didn't suggest I go, and the work was there. Her tack had needed mending for weeks, a whole pile of harness and leather work that she'd been putting off. And I could do that sitting at the table, and it seemed wasteful not to. We fell into something easy, those 3 days. She went about the ranch work, feeding and checking cattle, breaking ice, doing the repairs that always need doing after a storm, and I sat at the table and worked through the pile of leather, and when she came back in at midday we ate, and when Clem came in for his noon meal, we ate together, the 3 of us. And Clem told us things about the cattle or the fencing or about a coyote he'd seen at the east pasture, and Dora asked him questions about it. And I noticed the way she listened to him, really listened, not just waiting for him to finish and answered him like what he'd said mattered. In the evenings after Clem had gone home, we sat across the table from each other and talked. Not about much. The cattle market, the Buell brothers, and what to do about them, which she had opinions on that were more decisive than mine. A book she'd been reading, something about geology, rock strata, and ancient seas, and the slow, deep changes that happened so far beneath the surface of everything that you couldn't see them moving. "You read geology," I said. "I read whatever comes through." She poured coffee into my cup without asking whether I wanted more, which by that point seemed right. Tom ordered it once, and then died before it arrived. I read it after. She looked at the cover of it, which was sitting on the shelf. "Made me feel better, actually. Rock strata made you feel better. The time of it," she said. "All those years layered up. Everything on top of it so temporary. Whatever's weighing you down, it doesn't even register." She glanced at me. "Sometimes you need to be reminded you're not the whole story." I sat with that for a while. On the 3rd evening, she sat down across from me after supper, and she folded her hands on the table in that deliberate way she had, and she looked at me, and I knew something was coming because she had a particular quality of stillness before she said something important. Not nervous, just gathering. "You stopped," she said. I held still. I knew exactly what she meant, and I knew there was no use pretending I didn't. "I was cold," I said. "The leg. You stopped before you should have." She wasn't angry. She wasn't pitying me either, which I would have found much harder to take. She was just saying it the way you state something you've seen and are certain of. I've come up on men in worse shape who were still fighting. You were lying still. You'd decided something. The fire in the stove ticked. Outside the snow was blue dark through the window and very still. I don't know that I decided anything, I said. I think you do. She looked at me steadily. I think you were lying there, and you thought about whether it mattered much. Whether anyone would be all that put out. I put my hands flat on the table. They were cracked from the cold, and from years of rough work. And there was a scar across the right one from a wire tangle, 2 summers back. White against the weathered skin. I looked at my hands. My wife died 9 years ago, I said. Mary. She died of a fever in the spring. Fast, before anyone understood how sick she was. We had been married 11 years. I paused. After that, the place kept running. The cattle needed feeding. The work kept coming. But it ran differently. Like a clock with one spring wound too tight, and the other not wound at all. I looked up. I've been out here 12 years. I haven't built much that amounts to anything. The last person who thought what I did mattered, really thought it was Mary. Dora Prentice listened to all of that. She didn't interrupt, and she didn't make the face people sometimes make when they're waiting to offer you comfort. She just listened. That's a lonely piece of arithmetic, she said. It's just what's true. She was quiet a moment. Then she said, I know what kind of man you are. I shook my head. Dora, I do. Better than you think. She wasn't boasting. It was just a statement of fact, the way she stated most things. 12 years of neighboring is not nothing. I've watched you work. I know you fixed the upper post on my north fence last spring, the one that rotted at the base. And I know you didn't say anything about it because you'd ridden past it and seen it needed doing, and you did it without making an event of it. I know you rode out in that bad January 2 years ago to check on old Herb Cutter when everyone else had given him up. She paused. I know you sat with him 2 days until he could care for himself again. That wasn't... I know what it was. Don't minimize it. She looked at me. The trouble isn't what you've built or what you haven't. The trouble is that without Mary there was nobody to reflect it back to you what you are. And you've been so long without anybody to do that you've started taking the absence of it as evidence. I didn't say anything for a long time. She got up from the table, and she came around to where I was sitting, and she stood beside me, and she put her hand on my shoulder, just flat on my shoulder, steady, the way you'd steady a horse that was thinking about shying. She didn't say anything else. I put my hand over hers. Just for a moment. She said, Stubborn cowboys die alone. Not you. That was it. Like she'd decided it, and was informing me of the outcome. I said, You don't know that. And she said, I know you. That's enough. I rode home the next morning. The snow had settled and firmed, and the sky was that particular winter blue that's almost hard to look at. Cutter was fresh, and wanted to move, and I let him. The leg ached, but held. I thought about her the whole way home. I fixed the south fence the week after. And then, like she had suggested in her particular way of suggesting things, I rode over to the Buell place. Jesse Buell was in his yard when I rode up, and he looked at me the way men look at you when they think they already know how a conversation is going to go. I surprised him. I surprised myself, partly. I told him I knew he'd been cutting my line. I told him it was going to stop, and I told him if I found his wire on my fence again, I'd be at the marshal's office before nightfall. He said I had no proof. I said I had enough. He looked at me a long time, and then he looked away. I don't know if it was what I said or if it was something in the way I said it, like I meant every word of it, which I did. I meant every word of it, and I wasn't angry saying it. Just clear. He didn't cut my fence again that season. I started going over to Dora's place regularly after that. I told myself it was practical. She had heavy work to do, and Clem was good, but he was one strong boy, not a full-grown hand, and some of it was practical, but I knew what else it was. I wasn't going to pretend I didn't know. We worked alongside each other through the winter and into the spring. The work fit together easily. The way work fits when two people have both been doing it long enough to know each other's rhythm. She didn't do things the same way I did. She had her own methods, and some of them were better than mine, and some of them weren't. And we had a few frank conversations about that without either of us being too precious about it. One afternoon in March, a Sunday, She was repairing a piece of the corral fence, and I was replacing a board on her barn door, and we'd been working in comfortable silence for most of an hour, and she said, without looking up from the fencing, "Mary." What was she like? The question surprised me. Not that she asked she was a direct woman, but that she asked it so quietly, like it was a simple question. "Small," I said, after a minute. "Dark hair. Funnier than anyone thought she was if you didn't know her well." She took things seriously, but she laughed at herself, too. That's a rarer combination than you'd think. I kept working on the board. She liked mornings. I could never figure that out about her. She'd be up before light, no reason, just because she wanted to see the sun come up, even in February. Even when it was too cold to enjoy standing outside, she'd stand outside anyway. Dora straightened up and looked across at me. Her face was open. "She sounds good," she said. She was. We went back to work. Later, when we were washing up at the pump before supper, she said, without any particular lead-in, "Tom was a hard man to know. Good, but hard to know. He kept things in. I used to wonder if I'd ever get to the bottom of him." She dried her hands on the cloth. "I didn't. He died before I did." She looked at the pump handle. "I don't know if that's sad or if that's just how some people are built." I didn't answer that, because I wasn't sure there was an answer. But I understood it. There are people whose depth you never quite reach. Mary had been the opposite. You always felt like you were seeing all of her. Nothing behind a door. Tom Prentice, from the few dealings I'd had with the man, had been quiet in a way that felt like held back water, like pressure. I thought she'd probably earned some plain air after all of that. We ate supper, and afterward she made a pot of tea. She switched to tea in the evenings, something I'd noticed, and we sat, and she read from the geology book for a while, reading passages out loud when she found something she wanted to share. She read one about how the great formations in the hills to the west of us had once been the floor of a shallow sea, and I tried to picture it, all of this. The creek and the pasture, and the cattle, and the fences under gray water. Nothing above it. Makes the fences seem temporary, I said. "Everything is," she said, and turned the page. I went home that night and lay in my own bed, and looked at the ceiling and felt, for the first time in a long while, like there was something I was moving toward, instead of just enduring what was in front of me. It's a subtle thing. Maybe it doesn't sound like much. But if you've ever lost it, that sense of something ahead, you know exactly what it means to get even a small piece of it back. April came in difficult, like it often does in that country. Warm for a week, and then a hard freeze, and then warm again, and the cattle getting confused by it, and the mud getting into everything. I rode over to Dora's place on a Thursday to help her pull a calf that was stuck wrong, and we worked at it together in the cold mud of the barn floor, for an hour before it came right. And afterward, we stood over the calf and the cow in the hay, and we were both muddy to the elbows, and breathing hard. And she looked at me and said, with complete seriousness, "I hate April. Every year you think it'll be different." I said, "It's never different." She wiped her hands on her pants. "Every year I tell myself, this is the last year I'll be surprised." How many years has it been? She thought about it. 7 on this property. Before that, 4 years on Tom's family's place. She looked at the calf, who was up now, and investigating his mother with great interest. 11 springs, and not a single one of them has been what I expected. And yet, she almost smiled. Coffee. We drank coffee in the barn, while the mud dried on our arms because neither of us wanted to go back out into the cold. And we talked about cattle for a while, and then about other things, and then about nothing in particular. Just talking, the way people talk when the silence between them has gotten comfortable. I thought about how strange it was that a barn floor in April, mud on my arms and a new calf in the hay, could feel like somewhere I wanted to be. May, she brought over a pie. Just came to my door on a Saturday morning with a pie-dried apple, the last of her fall stores. She said she'd made 2, and had no reason to eat 2 herself. I said I'd come over to pay it back with work, and she said that wasn't why she'd brought it. And I said I knew it wasn't, but I was coming anyway. I came over the following Saturday and rebuilt the section of fence on her south side that had heaved badly through the freeze-thaw, and was leaning at an angle that was going to become a gap by summer. She came and went from the house, doing her own work, and around midday she brought me a plate of food and left it on the fence post and went back. She didn't hover. She didn't make me feel supervised. She just worked her day, and I worked mine, and we ate lunch separately without making an event of it. I noticed that. The way she treated my work as my own. June came. The grass came in thick that year, a wet spring for once, and the cattle were fat and moving well. I was over at Dora's place on a Tuesday evening, when the light was long and warm, and the air had that first real summer softness to it, that feeling you get in early June, when the year has finally decided it's done being cold. I'd been repairing the back corral gate, and she came out with 2 cups of coffee, and she handed me one, and stood beside me, and we both looked out at the cattle grazing in the long light. She said, "You're staying for supper, if you'll have me." She looked at me sideways, and there was something in her face that she wasn't hiding. "Why do you think I made enough for 2? I looked at her. She looked at me, and then she looked back out at the cattle like she hadn't said anything particularly remarkable, which maybe she hadn't. And I drank my coffee, and we stood there a while in the warm evening. I didn't ride home that night until late, and when I left, she walked me out to the porch and held the lamp while I mounted, and we said goodnight, without any particular ceremony, and I rode home through the warm dark, with my mind very quiet and clear. The way it only gets when something has already been settled, and you just haven't said it out loud yet. I asked her to marry me at the end of August, standing at the fence line between our 2 properties. I hadn't planned on that exact spot, but we'd ridden out together to check the line, and we'd stopped there, and it seemed right we were already between, already standing where the 2 pieces of land met. She said yes, with the same directness she brought to everything. No performance of surprise. Just yes. And then she looked at the fence and said, "We might as well take this down between the 2 properties." "Probably," I said. "No point in fencing ourselves from ourselves. We were married in February. Just the marshal, and his wife, and Clem, and old Herb Cutter, who needed 2 canes to walk now but who drove his wagon 12 miles in the cold to be there, and the circuit preacher who came through once a month. The ceremony was in her kitchen with the wood stove going, and snow against the windows. She wore her good blue dress, and she'd pinned her braid up, which I'd never seen her do, and I wore my clean shirt and the good belt buckle that had been my father's. During the words, she looked at me with those steady brown eyes, and I thought, with a clarity I hadn't felt in years, that I was a lucky man. Not lucky the way a man is lucky who wins something. Lucky the way a man is lucky who almost walked away from something without knowing its value. The preacher finished, and Clem let out a whoop that made old Herb Cutter laugh until he coughed, and Dora looked at me and shook her head a little, smiling, and I took her hand. We took the fence down between the properties the following spring, like she'd said we would. The cattle mixed and sorted themselves out, and after a while it was hard to remember which had started on which side. We kept both operations running, and Clem came into his own that second year, real capable, and started drawing actual wages instead of the informal arrangement he'd had before, which seemed right and long overdue. I still think about that night on the creek bank sometimes. Not often, but sometimes, in the way you think about the moments that were close calls, not with fear exactly, more with the particular clarity of knowing how things can go. I think about her coming down that bank with the lamp and the rifle and the dog, and crouching in front of me in the dark like it was the only natural thing in the world to do, like of course she was here. Of course she came. I think about what she said 3 days later, sitting across the kitchen table from me, not asking permission to say it, not hedging it. "Stubborn cowboys die alone. Not you." She didn't say you deserve to be saved. She didn't say I'll take care of you. She said, "Not you," like it was already decided, like she'd already written me a different ending, and she was just informing me of it. I don't take that lightly. Some mornings I am up before her. I make the coffee her coffee, the good dark kind she buys from the trader who comes through in September, and I stand at the window that used to be only hers, and I look out at the pasture, our pasture now. The cattle move slow and quiet in the early light, white-breathed in the cold, and behind me I can hear her in the bedroom, the sound of her sleeping or the sound of her waking, just the presence of her in the house, and it is the most ordinary thing in the world, and it is everything. There's a thing I want to say, and I want to say it right, because it's the most important part. This is not a story about being rescued. I want to be clear about that. There are people who might hear this and think a woman saved a helpless man from himself, and now he's grateful and that's nice. That's not what this is. What happened is this. A woman I had underestimated the depth of looked at me clearly, without flinching, and said, "I know what you are." And what she saw wasn't a man in trouble who needed charity. What she saw was a man who had forgotten something true about himself. And she named it. And she was right. That's a different thing. That's something a person can do for another person, and it doesn't make either of them smaller. It makes the one who sees it braver, and the one who is seen more whole. The courage she showed that night wasn't just walking out in the storm. It was 3 days later, sitting at her kitchen table, saying plainly what she had seen in me when I couldn't see it myself. Not to make me feel good, not to make herself seem generous, just because it was true, and she thought I needed to hear it. She was right. I did need to hear it. I've been a different man since. Not easier, I'm still stubborn, she'll tell you that. I still work too long past the point of good judgment, and I still have opinions about fence posts and water rights that I hold past what's reasonable. She has her own version of that. She's not exactly a woman who folds on her positions, and we have worked through our share of genuine disagreements, some of them not quiet. But there's a quality to it now that I didn't have before. The work has a reason behind it that goes further than just keeping the place running. We buried old Herb Cutter the following winter. He died in his bed in January, quiet, in his sleep, which is about the best outcome you can hope for at his age and in this country. We rode over together when we heard, and we helped clean the place, and we rode back together in the cold evening. And on the way home, she said, "He had a good life, I think. Not easy, but good." And I thought about that, the difference between easy and good, and how long it took some people to understand that those were separate things. I think about that creek bank less than I used to. There are whole weeks now where I don't think about it at all. And when I do think about it, it doesn't feel the same as it used to. It used to feel like the edge of something, like the edge of the ground before the drop. Now, it feels more like a marker. A place where something ended, and something else began. The sleet on the back of my neck. Cutter going down on the ice. The dark and the cold and the long quiet of it. And then a lamp, moving through the dark. And a dog's warm nose against my face. And a woman who crouched in front of me and said, "Your horse came in alone," like that was a thing that needed correcting. And she had come out to correct it. There are men who will tell you that the frontier takes. It takes, and it takes, and it doesn't give back. And they're right about that. It's true. It will take everything you'll let it take. And then it will sit there, patient, and wait to see if there's more. But some mornings the light comes off the snow clean and bright, and there is coffee made, and the sound of someone in the next room who chose to be there. And I understand something I didn't understand lying on that creek bank in the dark. The arithmetic I did that night was wrong. I had it wrong by exactly one item, the one I didn't know to count yet. Here,